crust can include the simplest of ingredients of only flour, fat, and water to complex blends of flours, fats, and liquids. Regardless of the ingredients, the key to making light and flaky crusts is almost always in the technique. Today, I want to share my tips on making a successful pie crust that I've learned over the years of baking and from what I learned from my mom and grandmas. I'll also include some science along the way. You know, pretty much everyone has a standard go-to pie crust, even if it's a store-bought version. Regardless, if you have a few minutes on your hands, you can make your own much quicker than going to the store and buying one. The breakdown of the 5 questions I'm addressing today is: 1. Is acid like vinegar or lemon juice necessary? What does science say? 2. Why do some recipes contain egg yolk, white, or both? 3. What are the 5 techniques and why are the techniques important? 4. What are some good flavor substitutions for indulgent pie crusts? And 5. What are some good standard tips to consider in making any pie crust? Question number 1. Is acid like vinegar or lemon juice in a pie crust dough necessary? Well, professional pastry bakers have battled over the need of or lack of acid for years. Some swear by it and others against it. It comes down to personal preference and what has been successful for them. You know, traditional American Southern pie bakers that I know don't use acid in their pie crusts, and neither do French in their traditional pie crust called pâte brisée, meaning broken dough, referring to the dough's flakiness. So myth or fact? 3 reasons why bakers use acid. 1. Acid prevents oxidation of the crust, keeping it from turning a strange gray color after a couple of days. Fact. You might notice a slightly less gray color in your crust when using an acid. So 2. Acid imparts a slight tang to the crust. That's fact. If you like a little tang, go for it. 3. Lemon or vinegar is thought to tenderize the dough since gluten begins to develop once water and flour are combined, alluding to the idea that acid prevents overworking the dough. Without acid, the dough might be tough. Believe it or not, that's an actual myth. Science tells us that acid needs to be at a much higher concentration than we can tolerate in a pie dough for it to reach the pH level needed to truly tenderize the dough. So, unless you use it for the tang, there really isn't a need for it. However, if you've had luck using acid in the past, then by all means continue to use it. You know the saying, if it ain't broke. Question number 2. Why do some recipes contain egg yolk, white, or both? Egg, yolk only or both yolk and white, is beneficial in sealing the crust, preventing the liquid ingredients from making the crust soggy. Meaning, you don't necessarily need to blind bake your crust before filling it. That might be nice. Question number 3. What are the techniques and why are the techniques so important? Well, technique number 1, hard fat is a high 5. Little chunks of fat create pockets between the dough layers. When the fat melts, it becomes steam, resulting in layers of flakiness. Did you know, though, lard is known to create the flakiest crusts, but shortening is a very close second. Butter produces a less flaky crust, but browns beautifully and adds flavor. So, my recommendation? Use half butter and half shortening for a little of everything. Technique number 2. Heat before baking is not your friend. Minimize touching the dough because warm hands melt the fat, resulting in a dense crust. Try to use utensils, but you can massage the butter with your hands. Just try to limit the time you touch the butter. Refrigerate the dough for 20 to 30 minutes before and after rolling it out. The cold prevents the fat from melting, which is why ice cold water or other liquid prevents the fat from melting and is suggested in recipes. The colder the liquid, the flakier the crust, so said Grandma. Cold also minimizes gluten development. Technique number 3, rolling large and less is best. Roll out the dough large enough to more than cover the pie plate. Strive for 2 inches beyond the perimeter of the pie plate. You want a nice overhang of dough to create a decorative edge. Use a knife or kitchen shears to trim off extra long sections, meaning those more than 2 inches beyond what you want. Use leftover dough to cover any cracks or errors, any little mistakes that you've made when you've been rolling your dough. Roll out as few times as possible. Roll hard and from the center. Rolling the dough actually develops the gluten, so rolling the dough on lightly floured parchment paper makes it easy to rotate the dough as you roll and helps to keep the dough from cracking. Technique number 4, blind baking makes a difference. Blind baking, or par baking as it's called, is simply partially baking the crust before filling it with liquid ingredients to be fully baked in the oven. The partial pre-baked crust prevents a soggy dough from the liquid ingredients. Use pie weights, dried beans, or rice on parchment paper or foil, or another pie plate of the same size with the bottom sprayed and sitting on the crust to par bake the crust before adding the filling. Weighing down the dough prevents the crust from bubbling up. You can also use a fork and prick the pie crust all around for the same reason. Technique number 5, blind baking is not always needed. Wait a minute, but didn't I just say blind baking makes a difference? Well, how about this? Bake at a high heat at 425 for the first 15 to 20 minutes, then decrease the heat to a manageable baking time of 350 to 375 for longer baking. There you go. That is how I bake my quiche and how my Southern grandma and mom both baked any pie they ever made as long as they were needed to be baked. And they made incredible sweet and savory pies. Use an egg in the crust to help the dough from penetrating liquids. It seals it. If making a quiche, put down a good layer of cheese on the bottom of the dough before adding other ingredients. The thin layer of grated Parmesan works great for this little step. That's what I do. The cheese layer helps to minimize the amount of liquid that sits on the dough. Question 4. What are some good flavor substitutions for indulgent pies? Replace water in either a savory or sweet pie dough with sour cream for a little tang. Just use half of the water amount. Replace water with an equal amount of milk or cream. That would make a rich pie dough. You can also replace water with a fruit juice that complements the filling. For example, apple juice or apple cider for an apple pie. See it? Change up the sweetener based on the filling. Use brown sugar for the sweetener in the crust for apple pies. Consider maple syrup for a pumpkin pie, but you would use less water. And finally, question number 5. What are some good standard tips to consider in making any pie crust? You know, all-purpose flour is actually best. It has the right amount of protein and gluten to provide needed structure yet a tender crust. Avoid kneading the dough. You only need to combine the ingredients and fold it only enough to create a disc. You can use a food processor, but be careful not to overwork the dough. In fact, you only need to use the pulse button once you add the fat. Then pour in the water through the top chute, a tablespoon at a time until just blended. Place the fat, whether it's shortening and or butter, in the fridge to chill well before pulling out the ingredients to make the dough. Place ice and water, a little more than you need for your recipe, in a glass and on the counter before pulling out the ingredients to make the dough. Strain ice out of the water before adding water to the dough to prevent unwanted pockets in the dough from small ice particles. If you want a little color and caramelization on your crust, add a little sugar to the dough. You can add granulated, powdered, or brown sugar. Pretty much any sweetener will work. Also, careful not to stretch the dough. Fold it in half and then in half again when picking up the rolled out dough to place in the pie plate. If the dough shrinks while you're rolling it out, that means the gluten has started to develop too much. Just place the dough back in the fridge for another 15 minutes or so to allow the gluten time to relax again. Then remove it and continue rolling it out. I hope I've helped in providing some valuable tips and tricks for ensuring you have a successful pie season with good homemade pie crusts. Thanks for watching. I always appreciate your time and support. I truly hope my videos are worth it for you. Until next time, go bake the world.